So I work for DG Translation of the European Commission, and I'm one of the 4 translation directors in DGT. So I'm responsible for 7 languages. These are Spanish, Irish, Croatian, Hungarian, Latvian, Dutch, and Slovenian languages. And I'm very happy to be here today with you and share with you some insights about the institutional setup of the translation of EU legislation. But let me start off by saying that Ukraine is a priority partner for the EU, especially within the EU Eastern Partnership. The EU-Ukrainian Association Agreement is the main tool for this partnership. And as you all very well know, since 2014, Ukraine has embarked on an ambitious reform program, and the EU has pledged a package of 12.8 billion euro for the next few years to support this program and this reform process. In this process, Ukraine is also aligning its legislation with that of the EU, and of course, translating EU law into Ukrainian is an important aspect of this work. Now, let me explain to you what the EU language regime is all about. As you probably know, EU has 28 member states right now still, and 500 million inhabitants. EU is translating from and into all the EU's 24 official languages, and each EU institution has its own translation service. Well, altogether, we have 4,200 translators working for the different translation services of the EU institutions, and about half of them actually work for the European Commission for DG Translation. And also to give you an idea of the translation volume in DGT, last year we translated 2.2 million pages of documents, and about 70% of those documents, of those pages, were translated by in-house translators, and we outsourced about 30%. So EU's 24 official languages are also working and treaty languages, and the language regime was established in its first regulation, the Council Regulation number 1 from 1958. And at that time, the regulation listed 4 official languages, but this regulation has been adapted every time a new country joins the EU. The fact that the first regulation was about the language regime shows the importance that is attached to multilingualism and languages. This regulation, the first regulation, is actually the reason of existence of the translation services of the EU institutions, even though the regulation itself doesn't really speak about translation, but the official language versions in all those 24 languages are authentic. The official languages are also the working languages of the EU, which are those used within or between the institutions. Actually, your rector mentioned the UN, which has actually 193 members and only 6 working languages. It's clear that for efficiency reasons, not all working languages are used all the time. So the same regulation says that the institutions can use procedural languages. For instance, in the Commission, the procedural languages are English, French, and German. And sometimes, depending on the file that is being treated, we can also add other languages. And it is perhaps important to mention here that the Commission staff are required to speak at least 2 of the official languages of the EU. And in practice, this means that to be able to work for the Commission, one of those languages should be English, French, or German. And as you probably know, English is widely spoken among staff right now, although it used to be French. And also after Brexit, if it happens, English remains an official language of the EU, because you know that 2 member states have English as their official language. These are Ireland and Malta. So I already referred to the legal basis, why we translate EU law. So basically, the translation of EU legislation is needed for the functioning of the Union, since translations allow people to understand their rights and obligations to the EU. You probably know that the EU adopts regulations which are directly applicable in the member states. So in order to implement and to follow those regulations, of course, they have to be translated. Now, what we translate in the Commission. Basically, in the Commission, half of the translations we do concern legislation, 50%. And the translations are really reflected by the 4 roles of the Commission as an initiator of legislation, guardian of the treaties, communication provider, and also an administrative entity. But it's not only the EU member states that need to have legislation, EU legislation in their own language. There are also non-EU countries which may have various reasons for translating all or part of the EU law into their language. For instance, countries who wish to accede to the EU and have received a so-called candidate country status, they have to translate the EU law as part of the preparations for the EU membership. It's perhaps interesting to note that the current volume of acquis communautaire, which is the body of EU language, amounts to 160,000 pages. So I remember that you mentioned that you have translated around 26,000. So you see there's a long way to go. And just for comparison, when Estonia, because I come from Estonia, when Estonia joined the EU in 2004, then we had to translate 90,000 pages of acquis. So, you know, it's really has almost doubled with those 14 years. But also countries which are not members of the EU, such as Norway and Iceland, translate the EU acquis into their national languages. They do so because they are parties of the agreement on the European Economic Area, and this agreement guarantees them free access to the internal market of the EU under the same conditions as the EU member states, and it's then obvious why they also translate the acquis, the EU law, into Norwegian and Icelandic. When needed, DGT translators meet with the translators from these countries to discuss translation issues, even though there are, of course, no formal ties between the translation services of the countries and the EU. And today, I'm very, very glad that we, from the Commission's Translation Service, meet also the Ukrainian translators and other concerned staff. Perhaps a word about our experience with past EU enlargements. This experience has shown that candidate countries tend to underestimate the complexity of the translation of the acquis. Challenges in the organization of the pre-accession translation work typically include the organizational setup of the translation coordination unit, selection of qualified staff, prioritization of translation work, monitoring the process, and of course, last but not least, the translation itself. So if not properly addressed at an early stage, these challenges can have a negative impact on the quality of translations. So I think that this is very, very important also for our Ukrainian translators to keep in mind. But let me finally also speak a little bit about the challenges that currently DG Translation is facing. We are increasingly feeling the pressure to do more with less. You know, there's a constant drive for efficiency. Nevertheless, no one is questioning that translation and multilingualism will remain an essential value and underlying principle of EU. We just have to be more efficient and productive. So how we are dealing with that in DG Translation? So to manage translation demand, we have adopted a translation strategy, and the purpose is really to match the growing demand to limited available translation resources. But the most important principle of this strategy is that translation is part of the EU decision-making. Basically, we are co-drafting legislation, EU legislation, in all those 24 languages, because as I said, all those texts are authentic. And this translation strategy has to be followed by all Commission services. It really specifies what needs to be translated so that we don't translate unnecessary texts, into which languages, and also the translation time that is needed. And it allows us to better plan the translation work. We are also, we have concluded so-called service level agreements with our Commission departments, or DGs, in order to really be aware of mutual expectations in respect of operational aspects of translation. And DG Translation has assigned so-called portfolio managers to liaise with each of the Commission departments who are requesting translations in order, again, to improve awareness raising at both sides so that we know exactly what the needs and constraints are. I think this kind of cooperation between translation services and the requesters is very important, and I hope that this applies to the Ukrainian setup. Perhaps I would also mention that we assign so-called lead translators for large packages to act as a kind of contact point between all translators and the requester, because sometimes there are lots of questions because the originals may not be understandable, they may be ambiguous, there may be errors in the originals, so translators need to get back to the requesters to sort out those issues, and this is then the task of the lead translator. So I mentioned demand management as one way of trying to be more efficient. Of course, I should also mention that we want to be very efficient in our processes, translation process. We have a quality management framework, we have a terminology framework in place in order to give clear guidance to translators as regards quality requirements. And needless to say, terminology work is very important. There will be a special session on terminology, and you will also hear how terminology is organized in the Commission. But coming back to the pressure to be more efficient, so in the coming years, DG Translation will have to reduce its translation staff, its internal translation staff, and as I said, currently we are outsourcing around 30%. But we plan to go, if necessary, we plan to go up to 50% of outsourcing. We will see, this is for the next 5 to 7 years. And of course, for that, we need very good contractors in the member states to really provide high-quality translation. And also, I would like to mention the role of technology. Of course, it's very important. Language technology is developing very, very fast. We are using CAT tools, as is the case for your translators, I believe. And in addition to that, we are also using machine translation. The Commission, DGT, has actually developed e-translation, which is based on neural machine translation, which is also made available to the national authorities of the member states. So all our translators have this integrated translation environment, the CAT tool, and also machine translation, and they can then decide whether they want to also include machine translation output. And then, of course, they need to edit and revise that, because just to remember that we have to produce high-quality translations of legislation. And even if neural machine translation is providing very good output, especially for certain languages like, from English to French and Spanish to Italian, we still need translators, human translators, to check the text to make sure that it is accurate. So the role of translator is there, it is changing, and we are also currently discussing that in our DG, how to best adjust our translation profiles to the changing world. So I think that's in brief what I wanted to share with you, and if you have any questions, I'm there to answer them. Thank you very much.